She spent the whole first date being exactly the kind of person I didn't know I'd been looking for. And then, right when I was about to say something I couldn't take back, she looked at me like she was already apologizing for existing and said, "You can leave. I'm a single mom." The way she said it wasn't dramatic. That was the part that got me. She said it the way you tell someone the restaurant doesn't have the thing they ordered. Factually, preemptively, like she'd learned to deliver the information before the conversation got far enough to hurt more than it had to. I didn't leave. But I didn't say the right thing either, and by the time I figured out what the right thing was, it was complicated in the specific way things get complicated when you're a 34-year-old emergency physician who's good at crises and remarkably bad at the part that comes after. I should clarify that I met Sara Mitchell while teaching a CPR certification course, which is not a typical origin story for anything romantic, and I'm aware of how that sounds. The hospital I work at runs quarterly community training sessions. Standard stuff, 2-hour certification, mostly people who want the card for liability reasons and spend the first 40 minutes checking their phones. Sara Mitchell arrived late, slightly out of breath, carrying a tote bag with a crayon drawing on the outside that I later learned was a gift from one of her students. Her school had started requiring certification after a playground scare the year before. A kid had collapsed at recess and the teacher closest to him hadn't known what to do. And Sara had apparently scheduled this particular session 6 times before finding one that fit around her schedule. She sat in the back row, looked at the mannequin on the table with an expression somewhere between determination and dread, and raised her hand before I'd finished explaining the agenda. "How hard did you actually push?" "Harder than you think," I said. "You can't hurt the mannequin." I've seen what elementary school desks do to full-grown adults. I have a very healthy respect for inanimate objects and their structural integrity. 3 people laughed. I noticed which 3 people laughed, and I also noticed that Sara Mitchell was already looking back at her notebook, having made the joke, and immediately moved on, which is either confidence or a habit of not watching to see how things land, and I couldn't tell which. I found out later it was the second one. She'd learned not to watch. The class itself was unremarkable except for the part where Sara Mitchell took it extremely seriously in a way that was slightly at odds with the dry humor she'd opened with. She asked actual questions, good ones, the kind that suggested she'd thought about this before the class rather than during it. She practiced the compressions with the focused repetition of someone who understood that muscle memory was the point and performance wasn't. At the end, when most people were filling out their certification paperwork with the enthusiasm of people who'd gotten through a necessary obligation, she was still at the mannequin, running through the sequence one more time. "You've passed," I said, coming over. "You don't need to practice more." "I know. I'm practicing more anyway." She looked up. "I teach 7-year-olds. The statistical likelihood that I will actually need to use this at some point is not 0. I'd rather have it in my hands than my head. That's the right way to think about it." "Thank you. I'm full of right ways to think about things. It's the executing them part that gets variable." I handed her the certification card. Our hands touched. Not dramatically, just the brief contact of a handoff. And she looked at the card, and then at me with an expression I didn't have a category for yet. Something between thank you and something else I couldn't name from a single expression. "The glove," she said, nodding at the practice glove she'd been using. Do people usually give those back?" "You can keep it," I said, which was both true and also not strictly the reason I said it. She put it in her tote bag without comment. I watched the crayon drawing on the tote bag disappear into the strap of her shoulder as she slung it on and thought, "Ask her something. Anything. The window is about 30 seconds. "The thing you said about the desks," I said, "does that mean you've actually tested it?" "I have a very firm desk-induced theory about load-bearing surfaces. If you want to hear it, I'm told it takes exactly 1 cup of coffee to explain." "I'm done for the day," I said. "I know," she said. I watched you pack up." "Oh." "My name is Ethan Blake. I'm 34 years old. I work emergency medicine at Riverside General, which means I spend most of my waking hours in rooms where the outcome is genuinely unclear and the margin for error is the kind that matters. I'm good at it. Not in a way that requires much modesty, just as a fact about what I've spent 12 years becoming. I know what to do when things go wrong fast. What I'm less practiced at is the specific kind of slow burn uncertainty that comes with wanting something personal and not knowing how to apply the same clear-headed approach. Emergency medicine has protocols. Romance, I've discovered, does not. And the absence of protocol leaves me doing things like accidentally touching someone's hand during a certification handoff and spending 20 minutes deciding whether to ask for coffee when the window was clearly 30 seconds ago. Sara Mitchell was, from the first 40 minutes of knowing her, the most immediately interesting person I'd met in longer than I could usefully calculate. This wasn't a complicated observation. She was funny in the specific way that requires actual intelligence. Not performing humor, just seeing things clearly and saying what she saw. And she'd done the CPR sequence one extra time because she taught children and understood that the point of learning something was to be able to actually use it, which is the right reason to do anything, and not nearly enough people do it. I asked for coffee and she said yes, and we went 2 blocks to a place that served the kind of coffee that required knowing what you wanted before you got to the counter, and we were there for 2.5 hours. The date, it was a date, though neither of us used that word during it, was one of the best conversations I'd had in years, and I say that with the full awareness that I'm a man who considers hospital hallway conversations about patient outcome statistics to be good conversations, so my baseline is possibly not where most people's is. She told me about her students with the specific animation people use when they genuinely love their work instead of just being good at it. A kid who'd figured out multiplication 3 weeks before the expected developmental window, which she described as an event with the appropriate gravity. She'd been teaching for 6 years, had done a semester in South Korea in her mid-20s that she described as the most confused I've been since age 7, which I consider an achievement. She drank her coffee with both hands on the mug, a habit I noticed because I was paying attention to everything, which I didn't think was obvious and which she later told me was extremely obvious. I told her about the ER, not the dramatic version that sounds like television, the real version, which is mostly fast decisions and paperwork and the specific professional calm that comes from having made peace with uncertainty as a permanent working condition. She asked good questions. She pushed back on one answer in a way that was accurate, and I said so, and she looked mildly surprised, like she'd expected me to defend the answer instead. Most people don't say you're right that directly, she said. I spend my days figuring out what's actually happening. I find your right more efficient than the alternatives. That's either very refreshing or I'm going to find out it's much more complicated later. Probably the second one decided, I said honestly, well, most things are. She laughed at that, not the short surprised kind, the longer genuine one. And the evening had that specific quality of time passing faster than you want it to, which is either pleasant or alarming depending on whether you're ready for what it usually means. We'd been talking for over 2 hours when she glanced at her phone, read something, put it back down in the specific way of someone who's just remembered a thing they'd successfully forgotten for 2 hours, and something shifted in her expression, not disappeared, just recalibrated. I need to get back, she said, but I didn't think anything of it. Lots of people have babysitters. She gathered her things, the tote bag with the crayon drawing and whatever the certification glove was still doing in there, and we walked out to the sidewalk where the evening had done what October evenings do in Nashville, gotten cold faster than expected, and she looked at me with the expression I now know she uses when she's decided to say something she usually doesn't. You can leave, she said. I want to say that before you say whatever you were about to say. I'm a single mom. There's a kid, he's 7. His name is Jack, and most people hear that and they're very nice about it, and then they do the math, and I'd rather give you the math up front than have to watch you do it later. I looked at her. Sara, I'm not being self-deprecating, she said, which she'd apparently anticipated I'd think. I'm being efficient. You're busy, I'm busy, Jack is 7, and he asks a lot of questions, and the last person I dated lasted 4 dates and said, I just don't think I'm in the right place for something this serious, which, fair enough, but I wasted 4 dates finding that out, and I'd rather spend that 4-date energy on something that isn't going to end with that sentence. She looked at the sidewalk. So, that's the information. You can do what you want with it. I stood there on an October sidewalk in Nashville being handed a very clear exit by a woman I just spent 2 hours wanting more time with. And I did the thing I'm least proud of from this entire story. I said, okay, I'll call you, which is not wrong technically, but is also not right, and the look she gave me before she walked to her car told me she knew the difference. I drove home that night thinking about what I should have said, which is a useless exercise and also one I couldn't stop. The right answer, in retrospect, was something simple. I'm not going anywhere. Said with enough directness that she'd have known it wasn't the polite version. Instead, I'd said, I'll call you, which is the conversational equivalent of hitting the brakes without quite stopping. And she'd known it. And the look on her face when she walked away was the look of someone confirming an expectation they'd had all along. I called her on Wednesday. We went to dinner on Friday. We did not discuss the sidewalk conversation, which I think was a mutual decision made without ever talking about it. Two people who'd agreed to table an agenda item indefinitely. The second date was easier in some ways and harder in others. Easier because the first conversation had already established that we could talk for hours without either of us having to perform anything. Harder because I kept thinking about Jack. Not as a problem, as a presence that was real and which I hadn't acknowledged properly, and not acknowledging properly was its own kind of dishonesty I was increasingly uncomfortable with. The restaurant she'd picked for the second date was the kind of place that didn't require a reservation, but was good enough that you wished it did. The sort of local institution that gets recommended by people who actually live somewhere rather than people who are visiting it. She'd picked it, which I noted, because most of the date selection I'd done in my life had been driven by whoever was more decisive, and Sara Mitchell was, when she chose to be, extremely decisive. You picked somewhere specific, I said. I always pick somewhere specific. I'm a teacher. I make 17 decisions before 9 a.m. By the time I get to dinner, I have opinions. She looked at the menu without opening it. Also, I've eaten here before, and the pasta is very good, and I was nervous and comfort eating by proxy felt appropriate. You were nervous. I'm always nervous on second dates. First dates are easy. You have nothing to lose and all the cards still facing down. Second dates are when you've decided you want to keep playing and now there's something to protect. She opened the menu. Don't read into that. I'm just describing the neuroscience. I'm reading into it, I said. She looked at me over the menu with the dry expression that I decided was her version of smiling. I know. Somewhere between the appetizer and the main course, I said, tell me about Jack. She looked at me like she'd been waiting for me to ask and had estimated the probability I would at around 40%. He's 7, she said. He's missing his 2 front teeth right now, so everything he says sounds slightly different than it did 3 weeks ago, which he finds hilarious and I find mostly heartbreaking in the way kids finding things funny is heartbreaking. He's obsessed with rocks, not geology specifically, rocks. Like the individual rocks, he has named several of them. He's named rocks, Gary, Theodore, and Margaret. Margaret is his favorite. She's a piece of quartz he found on a hiking trail when he was 4, and he has never once questioned the decision to keep her. I laughed. The real kind, the one that comes before you've decided whether to let it. His dad, I said, and then wasn't sure how to finish the sentence. Left, she said, with the specific neutrality of someone who'd found the word that conveyed the information without requiring her to express anything she didn't choose to. When Jack was 2, not dramatically, just gone, incrementally, and then actually gone. We haven't heard from him in 4 years. She looked at her wine glass. Jack doesn't really ask about him anymore. He asked a lot when he was 5. I tried to answer honestly without saying anything I'd have to walk back, which is harder than any parenting book makes it sound, I imagine. He's good, though. He's genuinely a good kid, which I say not as a mom bias, but as someone who has spent 6 years professionally evaluating children, and I know what a difficult child looks like, and Jack is not that. She looked at me. He's also extremely perceptive for 7, which means that if you come around, he's going to form opinions. He forms opinions about everything. He had a very strong opinion about a substitute teacher who came for 3 days in April, which he delivered to me in the car on the way home, and which was genuinely accurate. What was the opinion? That she talked to the kids like they were furniture instead of people, direct quote. Sara looked at me. He's right. I met her at pickup. He was right. I thought about a 7-year-old who named rocks and noticed when adults talked to him like furniture, and about a woman who was watching my face while she told me this, and I understood she was running the same assessment Jack would run, just with more years of practice and not showing she was doing it. I'd like to meet him, I said. Not immediately, when it makes sense, but I want you to know I'm not treating that as a thing to figure out later. Sara looked at me for a moment. Then she said, okay, just okay. Not relieved, not dismissive. Okay, like something had been logged and processed and she'd tell me later what she thought about it. The third date didn't happen. She canceled 2 days before, a text that said, something came up with Jack. Can we reschedule? And then nothing else, which was either exactly what it said or something more complicated. And the version of me that spent 12 years trained on ambiguous information read it as probably the second thing. I waited 3 days. Then I texted, "How's Jack?" A pause, then ear infection. "He's fine now. Sorry about Saturday." "Don't apologize. Can I ask you something?" "Probably." "Are you canceling because of Jack's ear infection or because of the thing we didn't talk about on the sidewalk?" A longer pause this time, then both. And a third thing I'm not sure how to explain in a text. "Do you want to try explaining it somewhere that isn't a text?" Another pause, then "Yes, but not dinner. I'm not up for dinner. Can we do something that doesn't require me to look nice?" Which was how we ended up walking around Percy Warner Park on a Sunday afternoon. Her in running shoes and a jacket that had seen better years, me in the only casual clothes I owned that didn't look like I was trying to look casual. With the specific atmosphere of two people who had agreed, without saying it, that the outdoors was a better container for this conversation than a restaurant. She'd brought coffee, one for each of us, from the place 2 blocks from her apartment that she'd apparently decided was worth the detour. She handed me mine without asking what I took in it, which meant she'd paid attention at some point and filed the information, which felt significant in the way she probably hadn't intended it to feel significant. She talked for 20 minutes about the third thing. The third thing was that she'd been here before. Not with me specifically, but with the shape of things. Someone she liked, someone who seemed different from the previous someone she'd thought was different. And the specific exhausting process of deciding whether to let herself believe this one was different enough to matter, knowing that the cost of being wrong included Jack. "I can manage my own disappointments," she said, not stopping walking, looking at the trail ahead. "I've gotten very good at that. I don't need anyone to protect me from being hurt, but Jack is different. Jack is 7, and he forms opinions, and if someone comes around enough to form an opinion about and then stops coming around, that's a different kind of hurt that I can't just manage." She looked at me finally. "So I need to know, before this goes further than it has, whether you're actually here or whether you're in the phase where everything feels possible and you haven't done the math yet." "I've done the math," I said. "Ethan, I'm not saying it because it's what you want to hear. I'm saying it because I've had 3 dates worth of time to think about it, and I wasn't not thinking about it." I stopped walking. She stopped too, turning to face me on the trail, the park continuing around us with the total indifference of public parks to significant conversations. "I know what you're offering comes with a kid who names rocks and asks difficult questions. I'm not treating that as a complication. I'm treating it as part of the thing." She looked at me for a long moment. "How do you know you mean that?" she asked. "I don't know yet," I said honestly. "I know that I've been thinking about Jack since you mentioned him on the second date, and it hasn't made me want to call less. I know that when you canceled, I spent 3 days deciding if it meant something and then texted because I couldn't stop wanting to know if you were okay. That's what I have right now. I can't give you certainty, but I can tell you it's real." Sara looked at the trail, at me, at the trail again. "Okay," she said again, the same word from dinner, the same specific neutrality that was starting to feel the more I heard it, like the version of trust Sara Mitchell offered in installments because she'd learned that offering it all at once was how she'd gotten hurt before. We kept walking. She told me more about Jack. I told her more about the ER. The October afternoon did what October afternoons do eventually, which is turn cold faster than either of you was ready for, and she pulled the jacket tighter, and I didn't comment on it because I was learning slowly which things Sara wanted pointed out and which things she just wanted to handle herself. I had a shift that week. A long one, 36 hours across 2 days with a 4-hour break in the middle that I spent not sleeping, and somewhere in the second night around 2 a.m., in the specific limbo state the ER reaches after midnight, when the genuine emergencies had quieted and we were managing the aftermath of things rather than the things themselves, I found myself thinking about Sara Mitchell in a way I'd been not quite thinking about her for 6 weeks. Not the way you think about someone when you're distracted, the way you think about someone when something becomes clear. I'd spent my career in rooms where clarity mattered, where you had to know fast what was actually happening and what needed to happen next, and where the cost of getting it wrong was measurable and immediate. I'd gotten reasonably good at that kind of clarity. What I hadn't applied the same rigor to, apparently, was anything that happened outside those rooms. What was actually happening? I was falling for someone who had built very specific defenses against exactly that, for good reasons, and who was watching me carefully to see if I was going to do the thing she'd predicted. What needed to happen next? Stop acting like I was still deciding and start acting like I'd already decided because I had, and the pretending otherwise was just the ER protocol of caution applied to something that didn't need caution. It needed presence. I texted her from the break room at 2:15 a.m. I know this is late. I just wanted you to know I've been thinking about you and Jack. Not in a complicated way. Just, you're in there. Good night. She replied at 6:45, which was morning on her end and the beginning of another shift for me. You texted at 2 a.m. That's either very sweet or you're sleep deprived. Both, I typed back. Okay, she said. Good night and good morning, respectively. I met Jack on a Saturday afternoon in November, 5 weeks after Percy Warner Park and 8 weeks after the CPR class, which felt both fast and very slow depending on which direction I was thinking about it from. Sara had set it up as low stakes as it was possible to set up something that wasn't actually low stakes. She mentioned she was taking Jack to a farmer's market. Would I want to come? The subtext being that a public location with produce and strangers was a good environment for a first encounter with a 7-year-old who formed strong opinions quickly and then delivered them in the car on the way home. Jack was smaller than I'd somehow imagined, with the 2 front teeth Sara had mentioned, present now, grown back in unevenly, which gave his smile a slightly architectural quality that I thought he'd probably grow into and which currently made him look like he was always mid-thought. He had Sara's eyes and a very specific way of looking at new things that I recognized from her. Not staring, just thoroughly assessing. He looked at me for about 30 seconds at the farmer's market entrance. Are you a doctor? He asked. I am. How did you know? You watched that person over there. He pointed at a man who'd tripped slightly on the curb. Nothing serious, just a stumble. You looked at them the whole time they were stumbling. Most people look away. Sara made a sound I'd learned meant she was successfully not laughing. That's accurate, I said. Old habit. Jack processed this. Are you here because of my mom or because of the farmer's market? Your mom, I said, because 7-year-olds who form accurate opinions deserve accurate information. He nodded once, like this had been confirmed rather than learned, and went back to looking at a display of gourds with the specific intensity he apparently brought to most things. The afternoon went, well, isn't the right word. It went real, which is different. He asked me 17 questions. I counted because the emergency physician in me counted things automatically and also because each question was its own small assessment. What do you do with people who die? Whether I'd ever made a mistake. What the correct way to handle a rock you'd found was if you weren't sure if it was valuable. Whether I thought Sara was funny. I answered the first 3 honestly. The 4th one I answered carefully. She's funny, I said. And she knows it and doesn't make a big deal about it, which is harder than it sounds. Jack considered this, and that's what I think too. Some of the questions had wrong premises that I gently corrected, and some I genuinely didn't know the answer to, which I said, which appeared to improve his opinion of me significantly. Sara walked beside us and occasionally caught my eye, with an expression I was starting to recognize as her real smile. Not the dry humor version she deployed in public, the one underneath it. At the end, by the car, Jack looked at me with the same 30-second assessment he'd given at the entrance. Okay, he said. Okay, you can come back. He said it with the finality of someone issuing a ruling rather than offering an invitation. Then he got in the car and asked Sara if they could get lunch. Sara looked at me over the car roof with an expression I didn't immediately have a category for, something between relieved and something softer. High praise, she said. I figured. He said the same thing to Margaret the Quartz Rock when she passed initial inspection. She opened the car door. Lunch? The question came on a Sunday in December. I'd been at their apartment twice by then, but both times for dinner, both times with the specific low-key normalcy of people who are building something without making it a performance. Jack had shown me his rock collection. Margaret was, in fact, impressive. A clear quartz with an unusual inclusion that I could see why a 4-year-old had decided was worth keeping. I had not told him this in those words because he would have considered it professionally biased. I had told him the quartz formation was unusual, and he looked at me with the expression of someone who already knew. The first time I came to their apartment, Jack answered the door. Sara had told me he might. She'd said, Jack knows you're coming and he might answer the door. Just don't take it personally if he stares at you for a while before saying anything. But knowing something is coming and experiencing it are different things, and in experiencing Jack Mitchell answer his apartment door with the full focused attention of a person conducting an assessment was its own thing to navigate. He looked at me for about 20 seconds, then he stepped back and let me in without saying anything, which Sara later told me was a good sign. When he's not sure about someone, he asks them to wait in the hallway, she said. He's only done it twice, but both times he was right. The apartment was small and organized in the way that suggests someone with strong opinions about where things go, who is also outnumbered by a child who does not share those opinions. Clean lines interrupted by artwork on the refrigerator and a rock collection on the windowsill, and a pair of small sneakers that had been placed carefully by the door and then abandoned slightly sideways in a way someone had decided wasn't worth correcting. It felt more immediately than I'd expected, like somewhere people actually lived. The second dinner, Sara had put Jack to bed while I did the dishes, which felt like exactly the kind of ordinary that had started to feel significant, and when she came back to the kitchen, I was still there, and something in the room was different in the way rooms are different when two people have stopped pretending to be casual about the fact that they're not. The third Sunday, Jack caught me alone in the living room while Sara was on a work call, and he sat down across from me with the rock collection between us, arranging it ostensibly, but I had enough time with 7-year-olds by then to know the arrangement was incidental. "Are you going to leave?" he asked. He said it plainly. Not aggressively, not with the trembling chin of a child delivering a difficult question, just plainly. The way Sara said difficult things with the specific directness of someone who had decided the information mattered more than the delivery. I looked at him across the rock collection and understood with more clarity than most things I've been faced with that this was the conversation everything had been building toward, and that what I said next mattered in a way I needed to be honest about, rather than strategic. "I don't want to leave," I said. "I know that's not the same as a promise, but it's the truth of what I'm feeling right now." Jack looked at the rocks, at me, at the rocks again. "The others said things like that too," he said. "I know, I can't make that different. I can just keep showing up, and you can decide what to think about it based on what actually happens." He thought about that for a moment. He turned Margaret over in his hands the way he usually did when he was considering something. I'd noticed this, the way he handled the rock like a thinking tool. "The others said they were going to keep showing up too," he said. Not accusatory, just accurate, the way he was about most things. "I know," I said. "I can't make that different. All I can do is actually show up and let you decide based on what happens." He was quiet for a while. The apartment was very still around us. Sara on the call in the other room. The specific domestic quiet of a Sunday in an apartment where two people had made a life for themselves and learned to be complete in it. Then he picked up Margaret and held her out to me. I understood this was not a permanent transfer. Margaret had her specific spot in the collection, and that spot was not my palm. But I took her carefully, held her the way he'd shown me, flat hand, no gripping, and looked at the quartz inclusion that had made a 4-year-old decide she was worth keeping. "Good catch," I said when you found her. "I know," he said, without any self-congratulation, just as a fact about the quality of his 4-year-old decision-making. He took her back, put her in her spot with the precision he used for most things. Sara appeared in the doorway, saw the tail end of whatever was on my face. I don't know what it showed, only that it showed something, and didn't ask. She sat down on the couch beside me while Jack arranged the rocks, and without looking at me, she reached over and took my hand, and we sat there for a while like that in the Sunday afternoon quiet, while Jack worked through his collection with the focused attention he gave to most things that mattered. None of us said anything. We didn't need to. The CPR glove showed up again 3 months later, which is how long it took for things to fully stop being uncertain. I was at their apartment on a Saturday afternoon. Jack had a friend over. The friend was significantly louder than Jack in a way that seemed to energize rather than bother him. And the apartment had the specific productive chaos of children engaged in something only they fully understood when Sara appeared from her bedroom holding the tote bag. "I finally cleaned this out," she said, which I took as a statement about the tote bag, and which turned out to be true, but also more than true. "Found this." She held up the CPR glove from the certification class, the one I told her she could keep. "I kept it," she said. "I don't know why I kept it. I mean, I know why, I just hadn't admitted why until I was cleaning it out and had to decide what to actually do with it." "What did you decide?" She looked at the glove for a moment, then she held it out to me, not giving it back. The gesture was different than giving it back, just holding it between us. "I kept it," she said again, "because it was the first time someone gave me something they didn't have to give me and didn't make me feel like I owed them for it." I thought about the certification class 8 months ago now, her at the mannequin, practicing one more time because she understood that muscle memory was the point. The way she'd taken the glove and put it in the tote bag without making it a moment. The way she'd done most things, without making them a moment, which turned out to be its own kind of trust offered before you'd earned it, that I'd spent 8 months trying to be worth. Jack shouted something from the other room that involved a strategic disagreement with his friend, the particular volume of children who are engaged rather than distressed. His friend shouted back. Jack responded with the measured calm he brought to most things, which was Sarah's calm with 7 fewer years of practice. "I'd like to keep showing up," I said, "if that's still okay." Sara looked at me for a long moment. The specific look I'd been collecting for 4 months, the real one underneath all the others, the one that wasn't the dry humor or the preemptive self-defense, just her. "It's still okay," she said. The thing about Jack running to me when it happened was that it was the most ordinary thing in the world dressed up as something that wasn't. I came to the door on a Sunday in February, the kind of cold, clear day that Nashville does in winter when it's being serious about it, and knocked and heard Sarah's voice say it's open, which was the first time she'd said that, instead of coming to the door herself. I opened it. Jack came out of his room at a pace that, for a 7-year-old who assessed things carefully before acting, constituted running. And he stopped when he reached me and then, not dramatically, not performing it, just the automatic motion of a kid who'd made a decision at some point that I didn't know about, he hugged me. Just that. Arms around my waist, face against my jacket, gone again almost as fast. Already asking if I wanted to see the new rock he'd found because Margaret had a potential friend. Sara was in the kitchen doorway. She hadn't engineered this. I could tell from her face that she hadn't known it was coming either. Her expression did the thing I'd been cataloging for months, not performing anything, just present. The specific unguarded version of her that only appeared when she'd stopped managing what it showed. I looked at her. She looked at me. Neither of us said anything because some things don't need to be said. They just need to be witnessed. Jack was already back in his room asking something about whether metamorphic meant what he thought it meant. Sara answered him from the doorway, correctly, and then looked at me again with the small smile that wasn't the dry humor version. I crossed the hallway and she didn't move away, and I said quietly so Jack wouldn't hear, "I'm not leaving." "I know," she said. The same word she'd been giving me in installments. Except this time it wasn't the calibrated okay of someone logging information. It was the okay of someone who'd decided to actually believe it. She stepped back and let me into the kitchen to help with dinner, which is what people do when they've stopped performing the early parts and started living in the middle. Jack called from his room, "Ethan, do you know what metamorphic means?" "Rocks formed by heat and pressure," I called back. A pause, then I knew it. Sara looked at me with a real smile. Both of them, the dry one and the one underneath. And somewhere between the kitchen and the rock collection and a 7-year-old who decided he had an opinion about me and had acted on it, I understood that I'd been right about something on a sidewalk in October that I hadn't been brave enough to say properly. The complication wasn't a complication, it was the whole point. I just needed 8 months and a quartz rock named Margaret to see it clearly. We had dinner that evening, the 3 of us, at the small kitchen table that fit exactly 3 people, if nobody needed to reach across anyone else. And Jack brought Margaret out from his room and placed her on the table beside my plate, between the salt shaker and the edge of his placemat, with the careful precision he used for things he'd decided mattered. He didn't explain why. He just set her there and sat down and asked Sara what was for dinner. And Sara told him pasta, and he said good because pasta was structurally superior to most foods, which was a 7-year-old's way of saying he had opinions about food the same way he had opinions about everything. I looked at the quartz rock sitting beside my plate. Sara looked at me looking at it. "He doesn't do that for people he thinks are temporary," she said. Quiet, not performing it, just saying it the way she said the things that were true. I looked at Jack, who was explaining to his pasta that the shapes of different pasta types affected how sauce clung to them, which was either sophisticated culinary reasoning or just a kid narrating his dinner. Probably both. I thought about a playground scare that had sent a woman I hadn't met yet to a certification class, about a glove in a tote bag that traveled home instead of being left behind, about an October sidewalk, and a sentence I hadn't answered correctly in 8 months of showing up until the answer had been given for me, not by Sara, but by a 7-year-old who placed a quartz rock beside someone's plate when he'd decided they were worth keeping. Sara reached across the table and poured me more water without being asked. The specific small domestic motion of someone who'd stopped keeping track of the gestures because they'd become the rhythm instead of the effort. I picked up my fork. Margaret sat between the salt shaker and the edge of the placemat, catching the kitchen light the way clear quartz does, not performing it, just present, the way all the best things eventually are. Neat. What would you have done if someone gave you an easy exit before the conversation even started? And what would you have done if the reason for the exit turned out to be the exact thing that made staying matter? Have you ever found out that the complication was actually the whole point? Tell me your story in the comments. If you liked this one, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.